Why does that matter? Why is that part of?
In that time, you could offer sin, you gave atonement once a year for himself and for people. Not because of Christ.
Yeah. All that's a foreshadow of something else to come. Yeah. What else? Let's remember from last week.
Christ is better because all of that was the shadow, and Christ actually went into the true tabernacle after he died. It was less of the thing.
That's right. The true tabernacle not being a tent, but the presence of God in heaven, which no other priest could ever have. So yeah, it's a better covenant with a better priest and a better sacrifice. Everything's better that Christ has done. Why does that matter in the bigger context of Hebrews? Why is the author making that argument?
So then they don't need to look back.
Right. Yeah. So there's this temptation for whatever reason. I do think it's persecution we'll get to a little bit later in the book, but they're thinking, well, it'd be easier to just go back to the stuff that we were doing before. If Jesus is getting us on the wrong side of people who are making our lives miserable, let's just go back to what we were doing before. We'll go back to the old priests and the old sacrifices and the temple and all that stuff. It was fine in the Old Testament. Why isn't it fine now? Well, why isn't it fine now?
Because Christ did it once for all. And if we would go back to the whole way we would be rejecting his sacrifice.
That's right. You can't ride the fence on it. You can't have a foot in both camps. It's either the animal sacrifices or it's the sacrifice of Jesus, but you can't have both. Because the purpose of the animal sacrifice was to get you to Christ. So it doesn't make any sense to now get to Christ and continue doing all that stuff that was just intended to deliver you to the final place where you're supposed to arrive. If you have Christ as the better sacrifice, don't go back to the old one. If you have him as the better priest, don't go back to the earthly priest, because everything you have in Christ is better. And rejecting him is rejecting God. Okay, anything else you want to add from last time? Okay, now we're going to read starting in verse 11, which we covered last week, but this section all goes together. So we're going to read chapter 9, verse 11 through 28. When Christ came as high priest of the good things that are already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not man-made, that is to say, not a part of this creation. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, having obtained eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death so that we may serve the living God? For this reason, Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, now that he has died as a ransom to set them free from the sins committed under the first covenant. In the case of a will, it is necessary to prove the death of the one who made it, because a will is enforced only when somebody has died. It never takes effect while the one who made it is living. This is why even the first covenant was not put into effect without blood. When Moses had proclaimed every commandment of the law to all the people, he took the blood of calves together with water, scarlet wool, and branches of hyssop, and sprinkled the scroll on all the people. He said, "This is the blood of the covenant which God has commanded you to keep." In this way, he sprinkled with the blood both the tabernacle and everything used in its ceremonies. In fact, the law requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood there is no forgiveness. It was necessary then for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with those sacrifices, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter a man-made sanctuary that was only a copy of the true one. He entered heaven itself, now to appear for us in God's presence. Nor did he enter heaven to offer himself again and again, the way the high priest enters the most holy place every year with blood that is not his own. Then Christ would have had to suffer many times since the creation of the world, but now he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself. Just as man is destined to die once, and after that to face judgment, so Christ was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many people, and he will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him. Okay, so let's just do a quick review of verses 11 to 14. And some of this we've just been talking about, how the ministry and the sacrifice of Christ are superior to what came before. So Moses was the mediator of the Old Covenant, which provided this physical illustration of atonement using the blood of bulls and goats. But the blood of bulls and goats never actually provided atonement. They were based on the atonement that was coming later in the final sacrifice of Christ. Now, those sacrifices, those animal sacrifices were important, but they could only ever cleanse the people temporarily and externally. And they were offered again and again because they couldn't ultimately deal with the problem of sin. And Christ's ministry and sacrifice are superior because they are effective at dealing with sin and cleansing the hearts and the mind of his people. He accomplishes full, final, permanent atonement. Okay, now, how then does verse 15 connect with that?
Mediator of the new covenant.
And it's better. And why is it better?
Promised eternal inheritance.
Yep. There's in this new covenant, there's something that we get that's permanent. And it says at the end of verse 15 that he has died as a ransom to set us free from the sins committed under the first covenant. Now, if you remember back in Leviticus, I know that was a while ago, but we keep seeing it pop up. When you think about atonement, we talked about how there are two major components of atonement. One is purification from sin, and the other is the ransom of your life. So atonement requires that you be purified, and it requires that there is a debt that's paid to ransom you from the just penalty of God's law. According to what the writer's saying right here, the sacrifice of Christ does both of those things. He takes care of all of that. And it's not just those two sacrifices. You think back on when we looked at Leviticus. You start off reading, I wonder how it was for you when you started reading Leviticus chapter after chapter after chapter of sacrifices and blood and sacrifices and blood. And you get a lot of repetition. When I started reading it, I remember getting to about chapter 6 and thinking, another one. Like, why can't we just have one sacrifice that does everything? What the writer of Hebrews says is you do, and it's Christ. But in order to understand the weight of what he's accomplished for us, you have to see all the layers of those different sacrifices to really appreciate everything that's been accomplished by his one death on the cross. So, purification and ransom. That's the sin offering and the guilt offering. Jesus has done both of those things for us. He purifies us internally, permanently, and he provides the ransom required to pay the just penalty of God's law.
I heard that when the Solomon's temple, it was like 44,000 gallons of blood running to the Hebrews.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Because of all the sacrifice, the blood.
I was just reading something on Luke. I was reading about the opening chapters of Luke, and they said by the time of Jesus, when Passover came, they would slaughter easily 100,000 lambs over Passover. And they had divisions. By that time, they had these divisions of priests, and they had something like 1,000 priests per division, and they would come at different times to serve at the temple. But at a major festival like Passover, they would bring all the priests in. So you're talking about thousands of priests who would come to serve, because how in the world are you going to sacrifice that many lambs for that many people? It was big. There was a lot of blood, and there were a lot of sacrifices. Now think about all those sacrifices that go through the temple. Now, I mean, not only over a year, but just on the day of Passover. One sacrifice for all of it. All of that is taken care of by the one sacrifice.
And that puts it into perspective, because I would think it's just a small group of people, but when you think that the people that came out of Egypt, they figure it's over 1 million people. So, yeah, it's kind of overwhelming to think of how many animals were sacrificed.
So then think about the weight of what John the Baptist says when he points to Jesus and says, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." Because if everybody in the world were to bring sacrifices for their sins, whoa. One sacrifice for all of us. And the writer of Hebrews says that's enough. It's because of who it was, that one sacrifice is enough for all of us. Unbelievable. Yeah. So Jesus, through that sacrifice, he has secured a permanent, eternal, heavenly inheritance for us, blessings that we don't deserve. Okay, now, what's the illustration then that the author inserts in verses 16 and 17?
The will.
Yeah, what does he say about that?
Well, the one who makes the will has to die in order for the provisions to be implemented.
Right. Now let's talk about some of the wording right here. So in the original language, there's a word, the word that they use for covenant is a word that's broad enough to cover a will or a treaty or anything like that. So that's kind of convenient for them, not so convenient for us. But he uses this one word that can mean a covenant or a will. And so he uses that as his illustration here. As with wills and covenants, so too with the first, covenant under Moses. Okay, now let's just think through this whole idea of the will. Someone who's a beneficiary in a will receives the inheritance only if the person who made the will died. So death is necessary for any of the benefits to be received by the heirs. Now, other covenants, ancient covenants, functions along similar lines. For example, if there was a major treaty that was made between two nations, or two people who were important, not that one of the people had to die, but it was common in those kinds of covenants that they would decide the terms of the covenant, and then they would go through this covenant-making ceremony where they would sacrifice an animal. And the point of sacrificing the animal was to say, if I break the terms of this treaty, I deserve the penalty of this animal. So in a way, it's different, but there's a similar kind of idea with a will. The only way the treaty or the covenant goes into effect is with the death of the animal. Okay, so with all that as the background, if a death is necessary for the benefits of a covenant or a will to be received, how then does he apply that to the covenant, the first covenant under Moses? Verse 18.
Well, in the first covenant was inaugurated, therefore not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood.
Yes.
With Moses, there was a cutting covenant ceremony where God sacrificed an animal, put it in stew and laid it out.
That was with Abraham.
Abraham, okay.
Yes. But Mount Sinai, do you remember what happened at Mount Sinai? When God proposed this covenant to the people, gave them all these stipulations, they're like, yes, we're in. Was it like they shook hands and then it was over? Remember what Moses did? Well, actually it describes what he did. What does the writer of Hebrews say? What did he do?
He spread the blood of goats and
Mm-hmm.
the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop and sprinkled both the book itself for the scroll
Mm-hmm.
and the people.
Yep. So he wrote everything down, proclaimed the terms of the covenant to the people. They agreed to do everything, and then took the blood of these sacrificial animals and sprinkled it on basically everything. So he sprinkled it on the law, he sprinkled it on the people, and that blood ratified the covenant and put everything into effect. Again, the recognition being, the people deserve death if they break the covenant. The thing is, when they sin against the Lord, they don't die. Why not? Because already you're getting the picture of this relationship, this covenant between God and his people being secured ultimately in the new covenant through the blood of a sacrifice. And so if a death is required for the covenant to stay in place, what you get then with the animal sacrifices over and over and over is this picture of something dying in your place to take the penalty that you deserve. And that shows up already when they ratify the covenant. It's already right there, very clear that a life has to be given up for God and his people to remain in relationship with each other. So, yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I'm wrong, but the old covenant to me represents bloody death. But in the new covenant, when Jesus came, that blood brings life. I know it's death, but that blood within becomes life.
Yeah.
Am I?
Yeah. I mean, you see it, that's the goal in the Old Covenant, but you don't see it clearly until you see what Jesus does. Yeah, so when Moses, he sprinkled the law, he sprinkled the people, so the covenant's binding on them, but then he also sprinkles the blood on the tabernacle and all the furnishings, all the items that are used in the tabernacle rituals and the ceremonies. And then, well, you remember in Leviticus, how often did sprinkling of blood show up? Everywhere, right? Because it's not just that they make the covenant, okay, now we're done with blood. It's that it's this continual reminder in all of these rituals that there's an ongoing purification that has to happen. There's an ongoing payment of the penalty that people owe that's pictured in these animal sacrifices. Blood is everywhere in those Old Covenant rituals. And it's just a powerful illustration that the sin of the people affects their environment. It affects everything they touch. Without a death to pay the penalty for sin and accomplish atonement, they can't continue in a covenant relationship with a holy God. So that's made very clear right at the beginning when they make their covenant with God, and it continues to be put in front of them all through their relationship with the Lord. Okay, now, how does he summarize that in verse 22?
The law was conditioned by obedience to laws and regulations. The consequence, everything must be cleansed by blood, and without that cleansing, there is no forgiveness.
Yeah. So the law requires all that cleansing because the blood's a graphic illustration that pointed both to the seriousness of breaking God's law and to what's necessary for the people to be cleansed of sin. There could be no forgiveness, no purging of guilt until somebody, something, or someone died to pay the penalty demanded by God's justice. What you get then every time you come to the tabernacle with your sacrifice is, if you're offering this sacrifice, there's this reminder all over Leviticus. This is not your provision to atone for yourself. This is God's provision to atone for you. Now, how is that the case? Because it's pointing ahead to the final sacrifice, and by doing that, by making you go through this sacrifice every time you come to the tabernacle to worship, what it's reminding you is that forgiveness is free for you, but it is not free for God. Forgiveness costs God. And that cost is what's put in front of you every time you come to worship at the tabernacle. That in order for you to be in right relationship with him, he has to absorb the cost of forgiveness. And he does. And you get then the reminder, not only that you're a sinner, but that God has provided what's necessary for your sin to not stand in the way of being in a relationship. So, blood is everywhere. For the purpose of putting in front of the people an illustration that will help them understand when the final lamb shows up. I mean, think how much better you would understand the words of John the Baptist when he says, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world," if this is the environment you come from, right? I mean, we get it in an academic sense, but I think the Jews understood it in a very visceral sense. If you're someone who's been participating in these sacrifices, to have Jesus put in that category, there's a depth, there's a weight to that they would understand because God had put this illustration of the sacrifices in front of them and kept it in front of them for all these centuries. Okay, now, how does that argument then relate to the new covenant in verse 23? Right. So we talked about this before, how it's not that there's a tabernacle in heaven. It's that the physical tabernacle is an illustration of spiritual reality. And here it's clear the earthly tabernacle deals with physical kinds of things. All those rituals at the tabernacle are dealing with physical cleansing, physical issues. But we know what the ultimate problem is. The ultimate problem is not a physical one, it's a spiritual one. That stuff is never going to be adequate to deal with a spiritual problem. In order to deal with a spiritual problem, you need a spiritual solution. And that's what's being illustrated by the tabernacle. But the reality is not in the tabernacle. The reality is in the presence of God, and it's what Christ accomplishes in God's presence for us. So the tabernacle and all those rituals, they illustrate how sin and all the effects of sin have to be dealt with in order for people to have full access to the presence of God. But the hearts and minds of God's people, along with everything else in the spiritual realm, has to be purified if sinful people are going to be in right relationship with a holy God. That kind of purification requires a better sacrifice than an animal. An animal can give you an idea of what's necessary, but an animal can't accomplish it. They just point you to the better sacrifice.
You know, Sally, I think I'm a pretty nice person. If you don't believe me, I'll tell you. But, you know, I haven't killed anyone, and I'm pretty good. But I came across this thing, and he said, think about this. Ask yourself. And I've been thinking about it. Do I deserve eternal death for my sins? There's a lot of nice people out. Do I deserve eternal death for my sins? And of course, yes. Then I really thought about that. How deeply that is. And he said, you know, until we believe, until we believe that the death of Jesus, about the death of Jesus is not going to make any sense. And so I just asked somebody maybe this week to live with me, and they said, yes, I deserve death for my sins. And so every once in a while, throughout the week, I thought, do I believe I deserve death?
I was listening to something a few weeks ago where a pastor, there was a woman who had written in and asked a question about, you know, there are all kinds of people who aren't believers, and they're nice people, and they do nice things for their neighbors. And she said, I don't understand why people who are generally nice people, why they deserve, you know, judgment like that, biblical judgment, the kind of judgment that's described in the Bible for that sin. And I remember the pastor answered that question, and he said, the problem is that you're thinking about people in relation to other people, not people in relation to God. Mm-hmm. And he said, the thing is, you can be super nice to other people, but if God isn't on your radar, everything you're doing is causing treason. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, I hadn't really thought about it like that, but that is, that kind of what David was getting at in Psalm 51, when he said, against you, O Lord, we because I think he's not saying there aren't effects on other people. He's saying every sin is cosmic treason. Everything I do without thinking about God is I'm committing cosmic treason against my Creator. As if I get to decide, who I am and what I'm meant for, when it's the Creator who's decided that. And yeah, I think I wonder if the people of Israel, I don't know, because a lot of people just kind of went through the motions, but I wonder sometimes, did they have a better grasp of the seriousness of sin because they dealt with sacrifices all the time? Because they were confronted with this reality all the time to say, sin is not just about how you treat somebody else, sin is about how you treat the God who created you. And it's a big deal. I don't know. I don't know if they did or not. Lots of them offered sacrifices without faith.
Perhaps they can have a right view of grace even without that, because, kind of this hell and brimstone preaching that people, we're all going to hell, and but you have to have that in order to under, we have to have it, right? We have to have that in order to understand why grace matters. We don't have that. It's usually the case. I don't know, it's not about that. I really don't know. Really about that.
I've done some dumb stuff, but that dumb stuff is just going to make me
Yeah, and if you don't think so, then you don't need grace. And grace sounds nice, but I think lots of people don't want grace because it puts you not in control. As soon as you relate to God entirely by grace, you don't have any way to control him. You don't have any way to bribe him. He gets to call all the shots. That's right. He is, whether you acknowledge it or you don't. That's right. So the argument in verse 23, you could paraphrase it by saying that while ritual purification is adequate for physical things, it's just an earthly copy of the spiritual order. And a better kind of sacrifice is necessary to effect purification of spiritual things. God's people need inward cleansing, not just so their approach to God is free from defilement, but so that they can be a fit habitation for him. So think about that. Where was the dwelling place of God in Leviticus? At the tabernacle, right? Which is why it was so important that anybody who went into the most holy place was holy, most holy, to be most holy to go into the dwelling place of God. Where is the dwelling place of God now? It's in us. So how is it that we are made a fit tabernacle for the presence of God? Yes, through the sacrifice of Jesus and the work of the Holy Spirit. We are made most holy, not by all those ritual washings and sacrifices, but by Jesus and the work of the Spirit. Now we are a fit place for God to dwell. Now, how did Christ accomplish a better purification? In verse 24.
He didn't enter the tabernacle, he entered heaven himself.
Mm-hmm. So it's not a temporary man-made tent. He doesn't go into the earthly copy. He enters the true sanctuary the tabernacle pointed to, which is the presence of God. And why was his sacrifice superior in 25 to 26? Mm-hmm. Yep. That's right. So, when the priest went to the tabernacle, when he went into the most holy place, we talked about this too. There's no priest who ever offered himself, right? He doesn't prick his finger and spill his blood, because he's a sinner. What's it going to get him? So no priest offers himself, but that's what Jesus does. He comes as the high priest and he offers himself. And he goes into the presence of God with his blood as the one that's offered. And that the repetition of the yearly sacrifices, it was indefinite, and the indefiniteness of that, the repetition of it, made it clear that the blood of animals was not sufficient to accomplish anything more than temporary external purification. That's part of what's being communicated in the repetition of those things is no other sacrifice is enough to stop it. There's no other sacrifice you can have where you could say, okay, we're done. No need for this anymore. It has to continue until the final sacrifice comes, who is Jesus. So those sacrifices were tokens that illustrated what was required. But Jesus is entirely different because he's the real thing that all the token sacrifices point towards. He offered his own blood, not the blood of anything or anyone else, and he did it one time, not repeatedly. So when Christ dies on the cross, he dies once for all, and his sacrifice deals with sin. His blood was sufficient, and no other sacrifice will ever be made. In fact, the author says right here, basically when he talks about the end of the age, the coming of Jesus and his death and his resurrection brought about the fulfillment of God's plan, and it's the climax of history. Death and resurrection of Jesus is the narrative peak of the whole story of human history. When the high priest entered the most holy place on the Day of Atonement and sprinkled blood on the mercy seat, he was foreshadowing the climax of history, which is the crucifixion of Christ and everything that will be accomplished by it. Okay, now, what does the author add about the one-time sacrifice of Christ? In 27 and 20.
Christ has already dealt with sin.
Mm-hmm.
He's coming to save those who are eagerly waiting for him.
Yeah. So, death is a non-negotiable, unrepeatable experience, right? Human beings die once and then they face the judgment of God. There's been some exceptions, of course. There's people like Enoch and Elijah and Lazarus and Jairus' daughter. But you know what I mean. There's no reincarnation. You don't die and you get a do-over because you didn't get it right the first time. Death is unrepeatable. You die once, then you face judgment. In the same way, Christ died once. Because the nature of his sacrifice is different, it doesn't have to be repeated the same way all those animal sacrifices were. He died once, and his work is finished. His death was sufficient to completely purify his people from their sins. So, again, under the laws of Leviticus, people were constantly having to be cleansed from ritual uncleanness and defilement. But now there's no going back and forth between cleanness and uncleanness, between defilement and purity. You don't have to continue coming and offering a new sacrifice. Jesus doesn't have to offer himself repeatedly. The sacrifice of Jesus one time is enough to deal with sin permanently. So on the Day of Atonement, when we read through Leviticus, and Aaron, if he goes into the most holy place, and there are people standing out there waiting, what if he doesn't come out? You got a problem, right? Not just because that's bad news for him, but it's bad news for you if your high priest doesn't come back out. Because it means, well, why? Why is it a problem for you?
Because I can't go in and get him.
Yes, there's that.
And it would have been my sin atoned for it.
That's right.
Canyon.
So either your priest was not holy enough to represent you, or the sacrifice he brought was not sufficient. Or he did something in there to make a mess of the whole thing, like Aaron's sons did, right? But now you're on the hook. If your high priest isn't adequate or your sacrifice isn't adequate, you're on the hook for your own sin. So, if you're a spectator at the Day of Atonement, you're waiting for the high priest to come back out because that's how you know God has accepted the sacrifice that's been brought to him. And the high priest who brought it has been approved by God to do that. Now, there's a sense in which Jesus did it and he came back out. But the day that Jesus came back out was the day of the resurrection, right? It's the day when he defeats death. That's the first installment that tells us the sacrifice that he offered was adequate. It was more than adequate. That's not the right word. Completely sufficient. He is the acceptable high priest who brings the acceptable sacrifice, and the resurrection demonstrates that to us. So, we have what we need as a mediator and as a sacrifice to come boldly before God. But Jesus is coming again. He's coming back, but he's not coming back to die a second time. What's he coming back for? For us, right? like he's not coming back to go through the whole thing again. He's coming back the next time to take us to be with him, to bring our eternal inheritance to realization, so that now we get all the blessings that have been promised through what he's done. He's going to bring the blessings of salvation to everyone who's waiting for him. And then we will see all of the benefits that are secured for us through his sacrifice. Now, when you talk about people waiting for him, the word that's used right here, it's not the kind of thing where you're just sort of standing in line at the grocery store and you're kind of... It's the kind of idea like eagerly waiting, like children on Christmas morning, waiting. Now, let me ask you, are we waiting for Jesus like that? What, I think sometimes when life gets hard, you start waiting for him like that. How do you cultivate in yourself an eager waiting for Jesus? Or what is it that sometimes makes you, not be eagerly waiting for him?
I think the older you get, the more you wait, and the more you get excited about it coming to life.
I think so too. And why is that?
The sin in the world.
You get cynical. No. In a certain sense, though, you do, don't you? I think when you're young, especially if you're healthy and things are going your way and you don't have a lot of problems, you tend to just think that you're invincible. And what you really want is to say, God, don't come until I get this done. Don't show up until I've done that. And then the older you get, the more you realize the world is not actually treating you that well. There's a lot of suffering and a lot of struggle, and it's not going to change. And then you start to eagerly await a Savior who is going to take care of all that. I mean, now you look forward to being free from the pain and the weariness and the grief and the sin. You look forward to being free from sin. There was an author I read who said, one of the things that we have to be careful about is not getting too comfortable in this world. Because if you get too comfortable in the world, it's really easy to stop thinking about Jesus. But I think sometimes suffering is what makes us less comfortable in the world. I think that's one of the things that kind of stirs us out of a worldly lethargy and makes us think, okay, what's better than this? Jesus is better than this. All right. Do you have comments?
I want to go back to 15, because this really stood out to me this week. For this reason, Christ is the mediator of the new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance. And I thought about that. You hear this constantly, free will. And if we're called, it's full of free will because we're chosen. And then it also puts a real emphasis on evangelism and the fact that I don't know who's called. We don't know who's chosen. So I need to be really stepping up to the plate and evangelizing. And then that realization that it's not me, because if God's already, I can't do anything. It's the Spirit that does it, so I'm just to be light and to be used. And speak up when I need to speak up, shut up when I need to shut up. And that just really stood out to me.
Anything else?
A question about this, but kind of outside of this. So after they lost the Ark of the Covenant, they still had the tabernacle. They still went into the whole. What did they ever kind of recreate it, even though they had nothing to put in it? Or they?
So it disappeared when Babylon destroyed the temple. And there's a lot of conspiracy theories about what happened to it. Because like Indiana Jones, there's some of it. If you could look it up on the internet, there's all kinds of interesting conspiracy theories about what happened to it. But when they rebuilt the temple, and certainly at the time of Jesus, at Herod's temple, they didn't have the Ark of the Covenant.
Right.
So they are still going through certain rituals, but I don't know actually how they continue the Day of Atonement.
The
I'm-
God's presence wouldn't have been there, right, at all?
You know,
The curtain was torn, so the curtain was still there.
yeah, and they had, I mean, whatever they were doing, they were still going through certain rituals at the temple. But I don't know exactly what those rituals look like. I'm assuming the Ark of the Covenant wasn't there just because it never gets mentioned.
Right.
Maybe it was there and it disappeared when the temple got destroyed again in 70 AD after the time of Jesus. I don't know. But you still have that question of what were they doing and what are they doing? I don't know. And if the temple was there without the Ark of the Covenant,
Yeah, what are they
how,
sprinkling?
yeah, that's right. That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that.
Oh,
I know they're still doing rituals there. They're still having the Passover and all that kind of thing, but particularly on the Day of Atonement, what is it that the high priest does if they don't have the Ark of the Covenant? I don't know.
The thing I keep thinking about is Aaron's twig still in there? Is it all dried up, or is it just a little, yeah? Anybody else think this one? I think God could keep it any way he wanted. Yes, he could. I could visualize that twig when green bud, and then I think, well, the thought of his dead and just real. And then I think, well, yeah. And manna in the earth. Yeah. I don't know, I just thought it was holy. Those things were holy.
Yeah, and it's interesting too to think about whether or not the glory of God was actually present there. I don't know, because the New Testament doesn't talk a lot about that, but in Ezekiel, there's a prophecy that talks about the glory of the Lord leaving the temple before it's destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. And it's interesting then to think about the people putting up a temple and rebuilding it later, a temple where God is not actually there. So it's not wrong that they're still coming and doing the rituals, but when Jesus shows up and confronts them, you do get the idea from what he says about the religious leaders and the priests that an awful lot of the stuff going on at the temple is stuff that God hates. And all through the time between Malachi and Matthew, there's a lot of crazy stuff that happens with the priesthood, where they're actually buying and selling the priesthood. The Greek and later the Roman governments, they're putting into the priesthood who they want because there's political power and wealth that comes with it. Like it's a mess all through that time. That's one of the reasons Jesus has just such strong things to say about the religious leaders at that time, because they really are not doing what they were supposed to be doing. But whether the glory of God is there during that time, I don't know. But I do. Yeah, and he doesn't have a lot of good things to say about it. But you could Google it and see what they say. I was thinking maybe Sherry would Google it.
Yeah, I'm thinking, God, that's the first thing I'm gonna do. Somebody has an opinion.
There's probably things in Jewish tradition that would tell you what they were doing, at the time, if they didn't have the Ark of the Covenant, what kind of rituals they were doing.
Because there's not any indication that they found the Ark of the Covenant, right? Like that, I mean, it was.
It never gets
disappeared.
mentioned
It
again.
never was mentioned again.
Could have been built
It's
again.
not there now.
Right.
God removed it.
Right.
When's the last time the Shekinah glory was mentioned? Was it with Solomon?
I don't know for
In that
sure,
temple?
but I know that is one of the things that the prophecy of Ezekiel is getting at. That prior to the destruction by Nebuchadnezzar, the reason the temple could be destroyed the way that it was because the glory had already left. Yeah, it's not, the glory didn't leave because the temple was destroyed. The temple was destroyed because the glory of God had already left. And I tend to think, I don't know this for sure, I'm kind of going on a limb, but I think something similar about the bit in First Samuel when Eli's sons go into the tabernacle and they take the Ark of the Covenant out of the tabernacle and they haul it off into battle with the Philistines. One of the things I've always thought about when I've read that is how could they go into the most holy place and take out the Ark of the Covenant without just getting... I think it's because the glory of God wasn't there. I mean, when you see what the priests were doing and how they were treating the Lord, how the worship just desecrated everything, I just kind of suspect that the glory of... The reason it's not that the glory of God left when the ark left. It's that the ark could leave because the glory of God wasn't there. That's partly speculation on my part, but it would explain why they could go in and take the ark without.
I have another illustration given me this week about the will, and the pastor said, I tell my children, you can come into my office anytime. My books are very precious to me. You can come and take a book out, you can take it, you can return it, have to be returned. It's not yours, it's mine. But on my desk, you can have it. You can have my book. And I thought a lot about that too. Good illustration.
Question, what happened with the priest when he was not holy? And what happened with the sacrifice? Was
Well,
somebody else to do it?
the only time we know of that happening was, well, I guess there's two times. So we know that with Aaron's son. And at that point, other priests step in and do their work, since it wasn't the high priest. What's interesting, though, in 1 Samuel is that when Eli and his sons die, and the Ark of the Covenant disappears, well, it doesn't disappear, but it gets taken away by the Philistines and it ends up somewhere else. It really looks like at that point a lot of the worship comes to a stop. The tabernacle doesn't ever get mentioned again after that. And you don't get much about the Ark of the Covenant again until David brings it back to Jerusalem. So there were other priests who were doing work and whatever, but what they were doing, I don't know. There's a sense in which the worship stops when the priests are not there to do their job. The high priest gets, if he dies, you have to wait for a new high priest for all those things to start up again. All right. Any other thoughts? Anything you want to contribute? Okay. We will stop there. And just before I forget, probably